back.
We are back. We had an extended commercial break with some technical difficulties, but Mara Studios and the Poetess, she's bringing us back, and she's bringing us back better than ever. We are going to move this show along. We are so excited. We have Professor Jim Downs, author of Sick from Freedom, and here's the book. This needs to be on the Breaking Brown book list. This book goes into African American illness and suffering during the Civil War and Reconstruction. Mr. Downs' book, Voter Suppression in the U.S. Elections, History in the Headlines, has been recently published and includes interviews with Stacey Abrams and Carol Anderson. He is the author of 5 other books, and today he is here with us so that we can talk on this Juneteenth about Sick from Freedom. Happy Juneteenth, Professor Downs.
Happy Juneteenth,
Happy
Professor Downs.
Juneteenth to you both.
Yeah, welcome to the show. It's an honor to have you. I picked up your book and I haven't been able to put it down. The research that you put in this is so impressive. So thank you for putting this piece of work and research together.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So I really just want to jump in with you. There's a lot of ground we want to cover here. So one thing that struck me about your work is that you talk about the emancipation of free people, of ex-slaves, in a different context than I was used to hearing it. You talk about it in the context of it being a process, a military strategy, and a political strategy. And I think most people like myself kind of think of the Emancipation Proclamation as a stroke of the pen. Prior to we're slaves, and post we are free. So could you expound a little bit on the process piece of the emancipation of former slaves?
Okay, so when Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, he does it, and he actually even writes in the proclamation, he does it out of military necessity. What he's trying to do is to deplete the Southern economy, and by taking their laborers away, and then hopefully repleting the Union Army with Black people who could work as soldiers, who could work as construction workers, who could support the war effort. So oftentimes we have this sort of mythic notion of Lincoln that he's invested in the emancipation because of the fact that he cares about Black people. He cares more about their labor power and more about the ways in which they can support the military. So then what happens is men get recruited into the army. Some of the best get to serve as soldiers. Many of the other men are relegated to doing all of the kind of work that the white soldiers don't want to do. They're doing construction work, they're digging ditches, and they're the lucky ones because freed women and their children have nothing. So when we think about emancipation, we think about this shotgun moment of liberation. We think about this idea that enslaved people hear of the Union Army coming, they run to Union lives, they escape. Where do they go that night? What do they do that afternoon for food?
Absolutely.
If they reach the Union lines, they get in. The men are promised rations. The men are promised employment, and the women and children are promised nothing. Absolutely. So they're left in the environment, and they suffer from exposure, malnutrition, disease. And so they're basically placed, and this is the part of history most people don't know, they're placed in refugee camps between 1863 and 1865, and they're restricted in terms of their movement. They're quarantined in these places. And when disease breaks out, it spreads viciously among this population of people. And so this is long before the 13th Amendment. This is long before the sort of ending of the war. Tens of thousands of freed people die during the war and immediately thereafter because emancipation is more of a process that unfolds over time and in different places rather than this bingo moment of jubilee.
Absolutely.
So to even hear you use the term refugee, like we don't, in our language in American history, we don't hear formerly enslaved even referred to in that type of terminology.
Right.
You hear freedmen, which is sort of empowering, but refugee is actually a whole other kind of connotation.
In our own country.
Right, exactly.
Refugees in our own country.
So that's political. So they purposely, the government, you have to realize at this point, the Northerners, the abolitionists, they call these formerly enslaved people freed people because it puts a polish on their experience. It obscures the fact that so many of them are sick and dying. It doesn't tell the fact, as I mentioned in my book, that so many of them are left unburied. Their bodies are just left out in mass empty graves. So what the government calls them is contraband.
Yes.
And that's a term that leaves unsettled whether they're free or enslaved. When I was doing my research, I didn't want to call them contraband. That's a term.
But it's equivalent to property, right?
Still property.
So
Yes.
contraband is something like you're not supposed to do brown liquor, which we have over here on the table.
Right.
Wow.
Right. So they're called. So when I was working, and this is the benefit is like when you're a historian, you're working with other historians. There's a historian named Thavolia Glint who does amazing work. She's a Duke. She's in African American history and in the history department. And she and I were saying, you know what? This is they're like refugees. And that became our way of trying to explain this process of emancipation, that they're in these camps. It's we don't think about the fact that these camps existed. Today, you can visit them, but they're called freedmen's communities. These aren't cute little communities.
So the freedmen's communities are former refugee camps.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. And you could even visit them today in Camp Nelson. You can visit them in Mississippi and in Jefferson Davis's Davis Bend. Yep. And what happens is between 62 and 70, 1870, between 1862 and 1870, those are refugee camps. Now, you do have freedmen's communities that develop later in the 19th century. That's what Zora Neale Hurston talks about in Their Eyes Are Watching God. That's Tulsa. John Hope Franklin talks about that. That's later in the 19th century, 1890s, 1900s. Immediately after the war, it's these refugee camps. And that's the part of my book that I really just want to underscore, because we want this triumphant notion of freedom. But this moment of refugee lays a foundation for further discrimination, further prejudice, further oppression, and we don't even see it because the language we use masks it.
Yes, so let me ask you this, because I know in, I think it's Sugarland, Texas, where the bodies of, I think, men who were formerly enslaved, but they wound up being part of the prison, the early prison complex after the slaves were made free. And there was research done on their bones and how much physical wear and tear there was on the body. So when there is this moment of freedom and you have these bodies that are like just muscles literally torn from the frame of the skeletal system, how I mean, it sounds to me like that's a body that's easy to invade. That's a body that's easy to receive disease. And so what kind of happened that made the disease that happened during that time so possible?
Right. So what happens is, there's a few things that happen that are really important. The first is that when we think about the Civil War, we often have this mythic notion even about white people, that it's like this heroic death of dying on the battlefield.
That's what I hear on Twitter. I'm sorry.
Disease
but in all of the statues, this whole thing, it's about what they call the good death, the heroic death. You died in military combat. These people didn't die in military combat. Most people died from infectious disease. They died from dysentery. They died from yellow fever. They died from smallpox. So formerly enslaved people enter into this world that's pillaged by disease. By you think COVID-19 is bad. COVID-19 is like a walk in the park compared to what some of these people had to deal with. Then we have to think about this. What did formerly enslaved people do the day after they were freed, the week after? Where did they sleep? They slept outside. Yeah. They suffered from exposure. They suffered from the elements. They were malnourished. Yeah. We talked about this idea of, a lot of Black people had farms. Yes, they did later. We think about agriculture. It's not like a TV dinner. You don't put it in for 3 minutes and it pops up. It's like these people have to wait months to grow food. So they're malnourished. They're malnourished. They're suffering from exposure. And then they're also coming out of slavery, in which masters were much more invested in maximizing and exploiting their labor power. Where do you think this is where we got soul food from, right? It was like doctoring up food to make it better because they weren't even getting the proper caloric intake during slavery. So it's slavery combined with emancipation makes them that much more vulnerable for the diseases that break out throughout the 19th century.
Absolutely. And one of the most powerful things that struck me in the book is that you use some personal stories that I think you unearthed from Freedmen's Bureau records, the medical division. And
right.
Could you please just talk a little bit about the story of Joseph Miller? Because that one really struck me as I read about him and what happened to him and his family.
Right. So just when we think about emancipation, again, like the Emancipation Proclamation only happened to the Confederacy. Slavery remains intact in Kentucky in 1864. Joseph Miller and his family managed to not get separated during slavery. His children didn't get sold off. His wife didn't get sold off. So this is amazing that they survived slavery. As soon as they hear of the Union Army, they bolt. They escape from slavery. They make it to Camp Nelson. They arrive. The Army says no to Joseph Miller, would you work for us? He says, sure, as long as you provide protection for my family and allow them to draw rations, which is like hardtack. It's like a cracker and maybe some other basic food.
Yeah.
They agree. The family agrees, just like many others. There's about 800 other formerly enslaved people living in this makeshift camp that's adjacent to the Army camp. One morning in November of 1864, Joseph Miller is woken up by a mounted Union Guard. Now, this is a Union Guard here to free the slaves, support the North, etc. Yeah. And he says to Miller, you and your family need to leave this camp. And he said, no, I'm a soldier. I have this promise, this contract that you'll take care of my wife and children. They said, no, you're all being expelled from the camp. And Miller looks out to the horizon and he can see a wagon full of freed people being escorted under Union gunpoint. And so he pleads with the guard one more time and he said, my son is really sick. He's 6 years old. He can't leave the camp. Can he please stay with me? And the guard, the Union Guard, this is important. This is not a KKK member. This is not a Confederate soldier. This is a Union white soldier, says under gunpoint, I will shoot every last one of them, pointing the gun at his family and his children, if you don't leave. So Miller has no choice. Yeah. His wife, Isabella, and the 4 children get into one of the wagons. They go off to an unknown destination. Miller finishes the work that he had to do that day. He learns where his family is. It's miles away from the Union camp. It's November. It's cold. It's dark. There are no street lights. He has to walk through the woods. He gets to a boarding house. He opens the door. He sees a huge fireplace, people gathering around, trying to keep warm. He doesn't find his family. Scans the room again. He sees them in a corner. And he later writes in an affidavit, he said, they were not left with even a morsel to eat. He walks over to his family and his wife looks up to him and says that their son froze to death. Now, what is he going to do? This is not an infant. This is not a 1-year-old. It's not a toddler. This is a 6-year-old little boy. He now must carry a 6-year-old little boy miles back to the Union camp in order to bury him. It's cold. It's cold. It's awful. He has to break the ground. He has to bury his son. I thought that was the end of the story because Miller was able to write his affidavit and say what happened. But I later found records that proved that he and his wife and all of his children within 2 months died. It's unclear, of some form of unnamed infectious disease. And so this is the irony of emancipation. Here you have a family that made it out of slavery, but died during that process.
And
you wrote. Wait 1 second.
Yeah.
I just got to say this. So, we hear the Trail of Tears. We hear so many stories, and I am not trying to. This is an ADOS show. I am not trying to minimize the indigenous experience. I have a family that's indigenous. They live on a reservation in New York, but no one talks about our Trail of Tears. That's literally. That's exactly right. I mean, there's not much difference in terms of the story and that reality and just the idea of emancipation unfolding over time that that's different. I mean, that's so tragic and sad. And I have to imagine if you got into just the numbers,
absolutely,
the sheer numbers of life loss after that, like what did that look like?
Can you speak to those numbers, Professor Downs?
Hundreds of thousands of people died. But see, we have to be careful because you know what? Everybody wants a triumphant story out of slavery. People got mad at me and say, oh, why are you trying to ruin the notion of freedom? We want this story. People, even in the 21st century, are invested in this story of freedom. We're more happy to talk about the celebration than, as you described, to talk about the fact that the plight out of slavery was a minefield. The plight out of slavery was a trail of tears. And the other thing I can't find in the record, I just want to say this because this is the other thing I think about all the time. We know that the plantation was a violent place. These people didn't dance. They sprinted. They ran. They ran under gunpoint. They ran with people chasing them with pitchforks. They ran grabbing shovels. I mean, we have to think about that moment even of liberation and stop thinking about it purely as singing and dancing and humming liberty. As far as the numbers are concerned, the best way of describing it is this. I know that at least 60,000 died from smallpox between 1863 and 1865. I know 1 million applied for some type of relief during the war. Now, when I first talked about this in the book, people could understand this abstractly, but they couldn't get it concretely. COVID-19 helps us get it concretely.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Think about this.
Yes.
How many people were infected with COVID? We know how many people were infected with COVID if they went into the hospital and we were able to mark them and get a number.
Right.
We don't know how many people were infected in COVID within the Black community that stayed at home, that got better within the Black community, that their parents took care of them, that their wives took care of them, their husbands took care of them. That number is not part of the statistic. That exact process, that exact pattern of capturing the numbers can be sort of used to understand emancipation. The numbers of sick and dying are only the numbers that the government recorded. We don't know about all of the Black midwives. The term they used in the 19th century was old grannies.
Right.
They would see, the white soldiers would see the Black women and they would say, oh, these old grannies are taking care of them. Well, if the old granny took care of them, they never got recorded. But so many of those people, as I explained in my book, are found dead in abandoned barns. They're found in the fields. This is a part of history that hasn't been told. And I keep trying to emphasize it as this sort of lost moment.
Absolutely.
So wait a minute. Did the CBC, did Sheila Jackson Lee, did somebody call you to come before Congress to sort of testify against HR 40? And I mean, I have questions on the paper that I almost don't even have to look at because from the things that you're saying, and now there's all this talk about truth and reconciliation. Right. I mean, the reality is that you are someone who should have been testifying and not the young man who has a video in underpants. We haven't gotten the truth yet. You're giving us truth on YouTube, in terms of caliber of arguments. And Republican Mike Johnson, who's out of Louisiana, this stuff happened in his state.
It happened terribly in his state. People were left unburied in Louisiana. I mean, this is look. I'm ready to go. Yeah. We
can get you there.
I feel your fire. I feel your fire, Professor Downs. I love it.
I'm ready to go. I'm trying to explain that this happened, and I'm sort of frustrated by it because ultimately people want to gravitate towards certain kinds of narratives. They want to gravitate to certain kinds of stories. They don't want to tell other kinds of stories. But, I found this story because there was a woman by the name of Harriet Jacobs, a Black woman, a formerly enslaved woman. That's right. And people doubted that she wrote her book. Yeah. It circulated in Black circles and HBCUs. It was like an old Xerox copy. It wasn't until 1982 they proved that she wrote it. She wrote about death and disease, and I was like, what's this? Yeah. And I pieced it together and put it together as the book. And the book gets attention, but I do think that when we talk about even epidemics, like I wrote about in The Atlantic just recently, we have to realize that the federal government did not mention smallpox once between 1862 and 1870. You can go, I went through the transcripts. You can go through they didn't mention it. They turned a blind eye to the fact that people were dying outside of Lincoln's door.
Yeah.
And instead have gravitated towards this narrative of Lincoln is the great emancipator. Lincoln was not the great emancipator. It's very sad, but true, you know? And so his seamstress, Elizabeth Keckley, who you see in that movie, created something called the Contraband Relief Association. She was a black woman that said, I could see this is happening in D.C. I'm going to get some blankets, some food. Whoever comes in to this D.C., I'm going to help them. And she actually says at one point in her autobiography, poor dusky children of slavery, men and women of my own race, the transition from slavery to freedom was too difficult for you. So we have testimony of black people mentioning that.
It's powerful stuff, Professor Downs. And one thing as American descendants of slavery that we talk about is how government, both action and inaction, can negatively impact or has negatively impacted the lives of American descendants of slavery throughout the American history. And so one of the things that struck me in your book was you talk about how after emancipation, like you said, there was no plan. And we went from suffering to more suffering just under a different set of circumstances. There was no structure or framework there. Right. And so I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on, because you mentioned COVID-19, and we see much of the same kind of inequity today that has led into sickness, disease, and death. And so I'd like to hear your thoughts on the parallels. I know you say that that in the 19th century that was one of the greatest biological wars we've ever seen. So I'd like to get your thoughts on today and where ADOS stand in America.
So one of the things is, as soon as the governors start unleashing plans for quarantine, I start running into the night screaming, like, this is a dangerous thing. This is a dangerous thing for poor people, for incarcerated populations, for people in nursing homes, for people in public housing. Everyone, thought of quarantine as a kind of joke. We're turning our gyms into fitness centers. Look at me. I'm baking banana bread with my kid and cookies. Oh, I can't do my homework with my 2-year-old. Oh, it's cute. Yeah. It's not cute if you're poor. Mm-hmm. It's not cute if you're if you're stuck in a crowded environment. If there's 5 people in a 1-bedroom apartment in New York City, it's not cute if you're in an incarcerated population. And we've known since 1750, before the development of germ theory, before they understood what a virus was, that you cannot crowd people together. And everyone ignored that point. And then on top of it said, euphemistically, oh, you people over here, you're essential workers. So now we're going to have a population that moves in and out of these crowded environments and then gets sick. And then there was going to be a shock and a surprise that this is where the largest number of infection rates is. And so my point is that quarantine is not effective. This happened to the formerly enslaved people. They were neither free nor enslaved. Yeah. So they were placed in a refugee camp. They were quarantined. So when smallpox broke out among them, it spread. When it broke out among the Union troops, they just plucked the one guy out, took him far off in the field, set him up in a tent and said, come back in 2 weeks, right? You're going to be good. And if you don't come back in 2 weeks, it's fine. We'll just set the place on fire, burn your body, and it's done. With the black population, they said, you know what? It's spreading among that population. Maybe it's because they're inferior. Maybe it's because they are unsanitary. Maybe it's because they're promiscuous, which means they were not the way that Nelly Furtado talks about it, but the mingling of men and women together. So they start blaming it on the black people. Same thing today with COVID-19. Why are they getting it? Is there a racial, biological characteristic that we can look at? No, it is the way you set it up.
Well, in that vein, here in California, the newly appointed Surgeon General Nadine Burke Harris, she is a proponent of trauma-informed care. And if you actually, kind of like the enslaved body, if you look at the trauma that science has proven, Kaiser did a study that talked about how trauma manifests in disease, and heart disease in particular. Heart disease is high in the African American community. What's the other one? The sugar disease.
Diabetes.
Diabetes is high in our community. But if these are sort of the results of trauma just based on racism in this country, it's similar. I mean, it's COVID, but of course it's going to hit us because our bodies are already affected.
Right. Well, it's like, because poverty and racism is a pre-existing condition. Absolutely. I mean, everyone's talking about, what are the pre-existing conditions? It is the biological part. It is diabetes. It is that, but it's also these other social issues create an underlying condition that allows the virus to spread among people. So it's, people with COVID, they continue to look at it purely from a biological perspective or a variety. They weren't thinking about it in the context of these other things. And historians have always placed it in context of other things. Public health people have as well. So it's the material's out there. Yeah. It's just a question of who's going to access it and do you want to access it? Quarantine might not have been the best method. Going into poor Black communities and educating people about the symptoms and the signs of the virus would have armed Black mothers and Black women and Black parents with the knowledge of what to do and how to prevent it. Instead, by sort of quarantining people, saying that only epidemiologists know what's going on, you disarmed the basic tenets of how healthcare has been unfolding for generations, which is within the family, by parents and by women themselves. So it was just a nightmare, quite frankly.
Absolutely, Dr. Downs. And we have just a few minutes here, but I did want to wrap up with one question, because I think what we're hearing today in the underlying themes of Juneteenth and Emancipation is delayed freedom and unrealized promises of America as it pertains to ADOS, right? As it pertains to American descendants of slavery. And so we are reparations advocates. And so we are fighting for that justice, that economic justice, and for full citizenship here in the country that we built. And so I'd like to get your thoughts, given your research and what you know about the emancipation and how it impacted our communities, your thoughts on reparations and the case for reparations, the validity of reparations.
I mean, I think this is just part of exactly what we've already hit on earlier, which is whatever committee is making this decision, they need to have all of the facts in front of them, and they don't. I think that one of the most compelling aspects for me around reparations was the case of slavery, which many people have made very persuasively, but also Jim Crow. And to sort of say that Jim Crow was not that far away, it was only a generation or two away. So if you are the descendant of a person of African descent who was discriminated against during Jim Crow, your likelihood of being able to advance has been very much hindered. We need to also, in that chronology, explain this broader mortality, these broader epidemics, to get a better understanding of how we're going to respond to sort of the question of reparations. Absolutely. I mean, there's reparations for other groups. I mean, the other thing I used to always say was, we have museums for before Obama, we had museums for Holocaust. Holocaust didn't happen in
the United States.
Say it again, Professor Downs, for the people in the back.
But I'm saying, we have these other museums, but now finally we are getting a museum for Black people, for the history of slavery. And this is necessary in order to provide a context to really explain to people what happened, so more people are informed, and then it just becomes a matter of automatic. It's clear. You don't need to build an argument. You have the evidence persuades you.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, Sheila Jackson Lee, we're calling on you because Professor Jim Downs here today. He is just giving, he's given almost indisputable information that we think people need to hear. We want to emphasize your book one more time.
Everyone, please go.
Professor Jim Downs, author of Sick from Freedom. We thank you so much for being able to join us today. This was just great. We could do this again. We may have you back.
Happy to do it.
Please, family, go pick up Jim Downs' book. It is phenomenal, and it uncovers, as you've heard here, pieces of history that we just don't hear. This is not being taught in our schools, and we're not being told this history.
Right. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here, Professor.
All right. I'll get you later.
Okey-doke.
Whoa.
All right.
That's a Juneteenth conversation.
That's a Juneteenth conversation for real. I think that I'm so glad that we're able to even do this show. One of the things that ADOS Los Angeles has been doing is meeting with our leadership. There's always this argument of having to hold our leaders accountable. And then the question becomes, well, who holds those leaders accountable? And there are ADOS chapters forming around the country, from Ohio to New York to Georgia. We have North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas. I think we have some new people in Vegas, and which is in Nevada, and it's important that we hold our leaders accountable. And it doesn't mean it's the people that are doing it. And so as we transition out, we are debuting our show because of the importance of June 19th.
To celebrate.
Politics in Black will continue the second Sunday and the fourth Sunday of every month from 2 to 3 right here at Morris Media Studios. And so we want to thank you so much for being here with us and joining. We want to thank our guest, Mr. James Josie, founder of the Galveston African American Museum. Again, he is open to donations right now. Lucretia Burtz, founder of the Black Remembrance Project. And of course, Mr. Jim Downs, author of Sick from Freedom. Our caller today was John Evans. You can check his website out at lcjuneteenthorganization.org. Happy Juneteenth, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
4 to 5
Correction, 4 to 5 p.m., second and fourth Sundays. Politics in Black. Please join us again.
Census.
Do we have time for the commercial?
Yeah.
We have time? Okay. So we're going to quickly, folks, we're going to read quick promo. So, fam, in case you didn't know, it is census time. And did you know that the census is power? And it is only every 10 years that we get the chance to be counted. Census results impact the amount of funding our community receives, how our community plans for the future, and our representation in government. This 2020 census data will be used to determine funding for public services like schools, fire departments, and hospitals, planning of new homes, businesses, and neighborhoods. And it will dictate your state's number of seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. In all, over $1.5 trillion will be allocated based on 2020 census results. Please visit www.2020census.gov today and complete your census. If you are ADOS, check the box for African American and write in American descendant of slavery. Every response matters. We got to get counted, y'all.
All right, and I am being told California AB 3121, the regents of the UC system have passed a task force to study and develop reparations proposal on June 3rd of this month. In a vote of 13-4, the Appropriations Committee of the California Legislature voted in favor of a task force to study and develop reparations for African Americans. This task force will focus on resulting racial wealth inequity due to slavery and institutional racism. This is a win not just for African Americans, but for California at large.
And that's exactly what Professor Downs was talking about. We need the information, right? We have to educate before we can actually legislate.
Yes,
absolutely.
Indeed.
So, man, this was a Juneteenth extravaganza for me. I had fun.
I had fun.
I don't know about y'all.
We're gonna celebrate with some Uncle Nearest
and some red velvet cake.
Red velvet cake.
And we'll be back. Y'all come join us again. Politics in Black
on the 28th of this month
by ADOS Los Angeles.
All right,
fam. Till next time.